In this video, we're diving into one of the most extreme economic collapses in modern history, Zimbabwe's hyperinflation crisis, where prices doubled every few hours, and money became so worthless that people used it as wallpaper. You won't believe how this disaster unfolded and the staggering impact it had on an entire nation. Stick around until the end to discover how Zimbabwe eventually crawled out of the wreckage and the surprising ways hyperinflation still haunts the country today. Hey, welcome to the channel. If you're fascinated by the strange and often terrifying twists of history, then this video is for you. Today, we're breaking down Zimbabwe's hyperinflation crisis, one of the worst cases of hyperinflation the world has ever seen. We'll take you through how it all began, the mind-boggling ways people tried to cope, and the long-term consequences that still affect Zimbabwe to this day. Stay tuned because the ending of this story will shock you. It's a real lesson in the power of money, or rather, the lack of it. To understand how Zimbabwe ended up in an economic nightmare, we need to first look at its early promise. Zimbabwe, once known as Rhodesia, was a country filled with potential. After gaining independence from Britain in 1980, Zimbabwe was considered a beacon of hope for Africa. It was blessed with fertile lands, rich mineral resources, and a thriving agricultural sector. The country was even referred to as the breadbasket of Africa because of its massive production of crops like maize and tobacco. However, despite its initial promise, Zimbabwe's journey was anything but smooth. The country was politically unstable, with tensions between different ethnic groups and competing political factions. Robert Mugabe, who had been a leading figure in the fight for independence, became the country's first prime minister and then its president, a position he held onto for nearly 4 decades. His rule, however, would soon lead the country down a dark path. The seeds of hyperinflation were sown in the late 1990s and early 2000s, with Mugabe's controversial land reform policies. In an attempt to redistribute land from the minority white farmers to black Zimbabweans, Mugabe's government began seizing land without compensation. While the policy was meant to address historical injustices, the way it was implemented had devastating consequences. Many of the white-owned commercial farms that had been producing food and cash crops were now in the hands of people who, unfortunately, lacked the resources or experience to farm effectively on a large scale. The result was a massive drop in agricultural production. Zimbabwe, the former breadbasket of Africa, quickly became a net food importer. The land reforms caused a sharp decline in food production, triggering a downward spiral in the economy. The government, desperate to maintain control and fund its programs, began printing money. And that's where the trouble truly began. By the early 2000s, inflation was already becoming a serious problem in Zimbabwe. Prices for goods and services began rising rapidly, and the value of the Zimbabwean dollar started to plummet. The government, instead of addressing the root causes of the economic crisis, continued to print more money in a futile attempt to cover its growing expenses. This only added fuel to the fire. The inflation rate, which had been hovering in the double digits for years, began to creep into triple digits. By 2007, inflation was out of control, and Zimbabwe officially entered a period of hyperinflation. But what is hyperinflation, exactly? Economists define hyperinflation as a situation where the price level increases by more than 50% per month. In Zimbabwe's case, prices were rising so quickly that it became nearly impossible for people to keep up. The Zimbabwean dollar was losing value by the minute. By 2008, Zimbabwe's economy had completely unraveled. Inflation reached an almost incomprehensible level. At its peak in November 2008, the inflation rate was estimated at 79.6 billion% month on month. Let that sink in for a moment. 79.6 billion%. Prices were doubling every 24 hours, sometimes even faster. To put this into perspective, a loaf of bread that cost 2 million Zimbabwean dollars in the morning might cost 4 million by the afternoon. And by the next day, the price would be even higher. People were forced to carry bags of cash just to buy basic necessities like bread and milk. Banknotes with denominations of trillions of Zimbabwean dollars became common, yet even these enormous sums were barely enough to buy a handful of groceries. The government continued to print higher and higher denominations of banknotes to try and keep up with inflation. You had $10 million notes, $100 billion notes, and even a $100 trillion note. But these notes were essentially worthless. In fact, at the height of the crisis, it was often more cost-effective to use Zimbabwean banknotes as wallpaper or toilet paper than to actually spend them. The hyperinflation crisis wreaked havoc on the lives of ordinary Zimbabweans. Savings became worthless overnight, and people's pensions, which they had worked for decades to build, evaporated into thin air. The economic meltdown led to widespread unemployment, and many businesses were forced to close their doors as they could no longer keep up with the ever-increasing costs of goods and services. For the average Zimbabwean, life became a daily struggle for survival. Bartering became a common practice as people lost faith in the national currency. Instead of using Zimbabwean dollars, many turned to the US dollar, the South African rand, or even goods like livestock as a form of exchange. Supermarkets became war zones, with shelves stripped bare within hours of restocking, as people scrambled to buy whatever they could before prices skyrocketed again. Hospitals ran out of supplies. Schools struggled to remain open, and many people fled the country in search of work and stability elsewhere. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation crisis wasn't just a financial disaster. It was a humanitarian one. The country's infrastructure collapsed, and the social fabric was torn apart as families struggled to survive in the face of economic ruin. So how did the government react to this unprecedented crisis? Unfortunately, many of its actions only made the situation worse. In a desperate attempt to bring in foreign currency, the government imposed price controls on basic goods. This led to severe shortages, as businesses could not afford to sell products at the government-mandated prices. The black market flourished, and people were forced to turn to illegal means just to obtain basic necessities. Meanwhile, Mugabe's government continued to print more money, fueling the hyperinflation even further. At one point, the central bank issued a 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollar note, the largest denomination ever printed in the country's history. Yet even this note wasn't enough to solve the crisis. In 2009, the Zimbabwean government finally admitted defeat. It abandoned the Zimbabwean dollar altogether and allowed foreign currencies, such as the US dollar and the South African rand, to be used for transactions. This effectively ended the hyperinflation, but it also marked the end of the Zimbabwean dollar as a functioning currency. After abandoning its currency, Zimbabwe entered a period of relative economic stability, thanks in part to the use of foreign currencies. Inflation slowed, and people were once again able to conduct business without fear of their money losing value overnight. But the scars of hyperinflation remained. The country's economy had been decimated, and millions of people had been forced into poverty. Even though the worst of the hyperinflation was over, Zimbabwe continued to face significant challenges. The agricultural sector, once the backbone of the economy, had never fully recovered from the land reforms. Many of the farms remained underutilized or unproductive, and food insecurity was still a major issue. Politically, the crisis had weakened Mugabe's grip on power, though he remained in office until 2017. The hyperinflation crisis had exposed the deep flaws in his leadership and the cronyism that had characterized his regime. But even after Mugabe's departure, the country struggled to regain its footing. In recent years, Zimbabwe has attempted to reintroduce a national currency, but the results have been mixed. Inflation has once again started to rise, and many Zimbabweans remain skeptical of the government's ability to manage the economy effectively. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation crisis serves as a cautionary tale for countries around the world. It highlights the dangers of irresponsible monetary policy and the devastating impact that hyperinflation can have on ordinary people. The crisis also underscored the importance of political stability and sound economic management in maintaining a healthy economy. For Zimbabweans, the lessons of hyperinflation are still fresh in their minds. Many people continue to rely on foreign currencies, and trust in the national currency remains low. The country's experience has also shaped the way other countries approach economic crises, providing a stark reminder of what can happen when a government loses control of its economy. Here's an astonishing fact. Even though Zimbabwe abandoned its currency over a decade ago, collectors and tourists still seek out Zimbabwean banknotes from the hyperinflation era, particularly the $100 trillion note. These notes, once worthless, now sell for far more than their face value as souvenirs and collectibles, a bizarre twist of fate in the country's economic saga. If you found this deep dive into Zimbabwe's hyperinflation crisis intriguing, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating stories from history. What other bizarre economic disasters should we cover next? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.